Reactive Training Systems.
Hey, what's up, y'all? Welcome back to the RTS podcast. Today, we're going to have a conversation about how traveling and moving can impact your training and what you can do to account for it. And it's a conversation that's been coming up for some of us RTS coaches recently. And we wanted to dive in and have a conversation about that with you all. So we have Mel Kasper, we have Gaby Muller, and myself, Ross Leppala, because this is something that's all impacted us a couple of different times. And so we wanted to have that conversation. And I think for preface, there's a couple of different ways that like this aspect can unfold, and trying to unpack it a little bit differently will be, I think, productive. So let's start with moving, because that's pretty fresh for you, Gaby, and what impacts moving creates for your training. What was that like for you recently?
Yeah, so it was a very interesting experience for me, especially since, well, now recently I just moved to Ghent, which is in Belgium. And funnily enough, there's also two other of my athletes that also moved here recently this year. I guess it's just a really cool city. Everyone wants to move here. But so I actually got to experience what it's like, how moving aspects can affect your training. Even though I have to say that as a coach, I would say I have the privilege that I can have a very flexible agenda and can adapt my training the way I want it, like structure the training the way I want it, as well as also my workflow, which isn't the case for people that have like an 8 to 5 job, for example. Yeah, I had to change my workflow, that's for sure, because for example, when the first days when I moved here, I had to do a lot of painting. So that was really exhausting. Then afterwards, I still managed to go to training, or sometimes I would even wake up in the morning because I remember the day when I got my keys was on a weekend, where the next day was actually also a competition where I had to handle. So what I did was I woke up very early. I went to training. I knew that I'm not a morning person, so training in the morning is pretty rough for me. In any case, I still made it work. So during that time, it was basically just like, it is what it is. And training won't feel optimal, that's for sure. I already had this mindset, but I didn't limit myself with it. I still went with the flow. I checked on how I felt during the warm-ups because, like, with all of the painting, the work during the competition, during that weekend, and also the entire traveling of just traveling back and forth a lot, that I constantly traveled back to Luxembourg to pick up my stuff and then traveled here, which was always like a 3 up to 4 hour drive, depending on the traffic. Um, so I still just went with the flow and just saw how I felt. So sometimes you surprise yourself and training still moves great. Sometimes you have trouble to get into the zone also mentally, because this is also something that I noticed with my other athletes. They just weren't that present in training mentally. Like they just got it done, and that's okay. That it's going to feel for a while like work, I would say, that you just start to execute and don't necessarily try to hype yourself like you used to, or just get into the mental zone that you used to get into, because you have other things in your mind that are more present in that moment. Like maybe you even think about the stuff that you have to do on the next day during the training, because you just um can't clear your mind that much. And so that's okay if that happens. You just have to know that it could happen. Maybe change your expectations, I would say. Just execute for some time, and then you will see, once like moving doesn't take forever, there will be times where it starts to calm down, like the most part of the work is done. So then you start to notice, okay, it's moving better again. So I really had the privilege of adapting my workflow, because I worked in the evenings a lot, which I normally tend to avoid. So I basically during those times didn't really have a lot of, I would say, me time to mentally also calm down. I just basically the entire day was filled with things that I had to do. Um, so, and then after 2 weeks or so, I noticed, okay, my training starts to go better again. But I'm really grateful that my training wasn't affected that much. Just during the times where it was the mostly affected was when I traveled on the days, because sometimes I traveled within a day, especially for the visit, to visit apartments. I did this in a day. So I traveled in the morning and then I did the visits and then afterwards I trained. Then I drove home again on the same day and I felt absolutely wrecked. So I have huge respect of Mel here, because she's also going to tell her story about the traveling, getting work done and also getting training done. So that was insanely taxing, but for the rest, it was actually pretty good. I'm very I'm very grateful that I have this privilege to be a coach, to move my work around the way it suits me the best, but not everyone has that.
Right. Which is sort of the opposite situation that Mel is in and the variables that Mel is facing. And that's where we wanted to look at this in two different lenses and two different parts, where you had the life considerations and impacts from moving, and not an insignificant move, a fairly big move that's multiple hours away, bringing all your stuff, moving from one country to another, comes with a lot of different variables and considerations that can be impactful to training. Whereas Mel is stationary, yet has a lot of travel impacts to her training through the work that she's been doing. Mel, what about you? What are some of your variables that are impacting your training, and what are you seeing?
I think something that came up to loop in also what Gabby touched on is the expectations of not stressing about it and letting the day play out how it's going to play out, especially when it began. And as I accepted this job, I knew it was going to entail traveling once a week and a day in, day out trip, most likely. Usually it involves a flight, helicopter ferry, or a 2 to 4 hour drive there to a meeting and then that back. And in knowing that, unlike a moving situation, I had to come to terms with this is going to be my life, and taking a lot of ownership over if a down day is coming or a lower performance is coming, that's okay. But am I doing everything on my end that's controllable on my side to mitigate any part of that down day? So when I first started traveling, I used to notice feeling quite gassed or a lower performance. Then I'd look back and try and go through my variables. Am I moving as much as I am on a non-travel day? Is my nutrition matching what it would be on a non-travel day, inclusive of timing? And is my sleep matching what it would be on a non-travel day? And from those, is my workload expectation the same and fair to have on this day as it would on others? So starting in August, I would experience the cognitive and training effects. And then I slowly peeled back those variables and seeing what was easiest to change and control first. And then those travel days started to become less and less of an impact on my subsequent training days. I've noticed the 3 hour drive there and back for one of my projects. I found if I split the training up to a morning session and evening session, I no longer notice the down days, as well as the company I travel with also recognizes the need to perform well at their jobs the next day. So they prioritize things like walking. It's a 3 hour drive, but 2 hours in, we're going to stop our car and we're going to go for a little bit of a walk. And I think surrounding myself with that kind of mindset and those people also helped alleviate some of that negative consequences. the moving one was probably a big one, making sure I'm making the time to somewhere in my day, get out of the vehicle or on site, take those extra steps, because I found that was a huge impact on recovery. And I think Gabby and Ross, you probably can
But
attest.
you once mentioned that you travel with multiple transportations. So sometimes you even use a helicopter. So do you notice that those kind of travels affect your training afterwards the most?
The helicopter ride is usually 3 hours, and we're usually going somewhere. And since we're chartering it, we can take typically as long as we want on site. And then we travel and go to site and we walk around. And the ability to manipulate that, once again, I'm working with a good crew of people that do recognize that they need to be present and have some sort of performance, whether it be in the office or for me in the gym the next day. So no one pushes back when we go for an extra walk or we walk around site for a little bit longer than typical on the multiple journey days. As long as I can make sure I'm traveling either on site or more recently, I have woken up quite early to get my steps in the beginning of the day if I'm not training. I think over the last 2 times I've traveled, having a half an hour walk in the beginning of the day at 4:45, 5:30 in the morning also played a really positive effect on how I felt the next day. And then making sure I got back that missed sleep by going to bed a little earlier in the next few days or banking sleep prior to that day.
I think it's very remarkable that, like, of course, you've been doing this for some time, but that you're so attentive to listening to your body, like what it tells you during those travels, and really try to make everything that is within your control 100%, like the nutrition, the sleep, even taking steps early in the morning. Like, that's very remarkable. Um, I think there's only so much you can do. Like, to some degree, it like those kind of travels will always affect your training, especially if they're once per week. It's very hard for your body to really get used to that because it's only once per week, and then the rest of the week it's going to be a different kind of schedule. So it's hard to get used to that. Do you actually adapt your trainings during those days or after the day of traveling?
I will try and get training done on the day of travel if I can bring my gear with me and find a gym. And I'll usually look ahead at the town and find at least 2 gyms in case the first one fails me some way. And that helps relieve some of the stress around training because I found that stressing or fretting about how I'm going to fit this into my travel worked so much against me that I started to put loose and general plans on how I can ensure stress levels come down, inclusive of these are the this is the volume I can drop. These are the accessories I can drop if need be. If this gym isn't open, here's another gym that's nearby. This is my important movement to get in. And if it can't be done today, I can put it tomorrow and perhaps drop something that will bank me more recovery. Because as Ross has said, you get stronger from what you recover from. So ensuring that training lines up from what I recover from has also been a humbling and hard thing to take because as powerlifters, we want to do all the work perfectly all the time.
There's some really good stuff here. And one of the places I want to guide this to wrap it around training is thinking about it. You just mentioned it, stress and recovering from stress. That's the main driver. And I really like to consider Mike's kitchen sink analogy that he talks about in a lot of different places. You have the input, the water flowing into the sink from the faucet. That's your stress input to, say, the organism, which would be represented by you, the sink. And the outflow, the drain of the sink, is the recovery. If the inflow, if the outflow can handle all the inflow, you'll never get water to build up into the sink. And what that is akin to is an inability to disrupt the baseline fatigue or the homeostasis, and therefore you won't actually adapt and evolve and get better. You have to have some volume of accumulation of water in the sink. And you also don't want to overflow the sink, because that's when we overtrain, we get over fatigued, we can't recover, we get injured, different things of that nature. The thing to remember about all these different things when we're traveling and training, the input, the water into the sink, the stress into the organism is not just from training, it's from all these different things. Whether it's sitting in a car for 3 hours, or sitting in a helicopter for 3 hours, or packing boxes around, that is stress. There's no way around it. There's no way to avoid that. But one of the layers that I think about with stuff like this, some of those stressors are, just like our exercises, easier to recover from. And one of the things that came to my mind for you, Mel, was like, sitting in a car for 3 hours for me is a lot more stressful than sitting in a helicopter for 3 hours. I recall back to being an engineer and flying around mountaintop sites in Alaska. And that was amazing. That was so cool. And so, like, recovering from stress that's cool oftentimes is way easier than recovering from stress that isn't so cool. And being aware of those things is important, because those are recovery mechanisms, or a, maybe the input is on higher than it is on another time. And being aware of those nuances is really important. What can we do to recover from those nuances? And I love to hear the idea of, like, waking up a little bit early to get some of your steps in and get your walk in. Like, that helps loosen the hips. It helps stretch the hips so that it can better handle being in a restricted position for all that time. So that's one thing that really came to my mind that I thought is really important from a consideration for us when we travel and we train. The other one that came to my mind too, that's really important, that I think, you hit on how us powerlifters a lot of times like to do all the work, whatever the amount of work is written in the program, we like to do it. And we use RPE to auto-regulate the load. The hardship most of us face is most of us don't want to use that RPE to auto-regulate the down session. And all we do is unnecessarily add water to the sink in that situation, on top of already adding water to the sink. And that's when things overflow, and we're not going to recover from the training stress and the travel stress. And at some point, something's going to break. And we have to be aware of those things as we're navigating our training. And the way I like to think about it now, as I've matured as a lifter, is I cannot ever be, I can't let my down days define what I'm trying to do. I have to just let them be down, whatever they are. Because I know when I let the down day be the down day, I am much more likely to limit it to being just that down day, rather than turning it into a down week, and that down week turning into a down block. And that is a critical component, especially when we have all these other moving variables. And being aware of, I think, as well, like, what part of it's fun and what part of it sucks. Do you find that similar thing, Mel, when you have, like, the different travel considerations for car versus helicopter?
Oh, for sure. Didn't want to exactly say, but yes, the helicopter ride is awesome. And it is so much less of a stressor than the drive. Driving, when you are the driver especially, is probably the most taxing, likely because you have to be cognizantly paying attention to the road for that entire duration. And I think that taxing really stays with you longer than a passive passenger on a plane, on a ferry, on a helicopter. And when I am a passenger versus when I am driving, I definitely notice and have made the decision before of lowering my workloads, maybe not hitting as high a RPE as I think I should,
Right.
quote mark, or dropping the last accessory.
For sure. That's similar to this. When in 2018, when I moved from Alaska to Georgia, that was spread out over an entire month. And the first part of that trip was a 4-day drive from Alaska to Fargo, North Dakota, to spend some time with a friend from college. And those first 4 days, it was all drive, all go, like nothing else. I slept in the back of my truck on the side of the road. When I got there, I took 2 days finally sleeping in a bed before I went to the gym. And that first time back in a gym, my squat and bench were down like 30 to 40%. It was awful. I couldn't move. It was one of the worst sessions I've ever had in my entire life. But I didn't push hard. I knew it was going to be down session. I just kind of wanted to go in and kind of move through space and try and reconnect with things. And I had no expectations of it. But what was cool was a week later, when we traveled to Vienna, Austria for the RTS 10-year seminar at Das Gym, I hit a 3-rep PR. And the week after that in Wrocław, Poland, I hit another 3-rep PR. And to me, that was like the big thing. Here you have very similar stressors with travel. You have an international flight, you had a 4-day drive, but one's easier to recover from because one's a lot more exciting and didn't require as much of my cognitive demand to be on for, driving through some of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, or not Colorado, but Canada. Like, I had to really be intensely focused so that I didn't go off the side of a cliff. That is way easier to overcome. And that was a big lesson for me, is realizing, hey, not all stress is the same.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like, I feel like when you have to drive a car for a few hours straight, it's so exhausting. And from my personal experience, when I drove to Belgium for a few hours, sometimes just to train, it's like I wanted to be there as fast as possible. So I never stopped on the way there to take walks or so. And retrospectively thinking I should have done this, but I just wanted to get there and start training and have fun with all those people that were training there. And I remember this year I was in the middle of a competition prep, and I was already dealing with some unusual amount of lower back fatigue, and I had a heavy squat session coming up. So what I actually did was I woke up early in the morning. I went to the gym in Luxembourg, in my home country where I lived back then, and I benched on an ER rack because I tried to keep benches consistently as possible, since they didn't have the same rack in that gym. And then after the bench session, I drove to Belgium to uplifting to squat with everyone else. And I had a heavy squat session coming up. And I remember when I got out of that car, I was like, holy shit, why does my back feel so wrecked? And I remember when I took my warm-ups to squat, all of a sudden I felt like 10 centimeters shorter. I felt super compressed. And yeah, also during that squat session, unfortunately, my back pain aggravated, and after that, I had a long time where I had trouble to get rid of it. So it actually really messed up my competition. So what I learned from this, and it's something that I had to learn a few times until I finally matured as a lifter, and I was like, okay, maybe it's really time to listen to your body, because what a lot of athletes have when like something's up, and they have to be flexible, they know, okay, it's a different situation, there's other stress, but they're stubborn and they still want to do a certain load because even though they have an RPE that is in their program, that a target RPE, they still attach it to a certain amount of load. And that is also very hard to get rid of when you're in a competition prep, because sometimes, depending on what kind of program you are in, okay, we're maybe going to wave load the RP and I should expect heavier load this week, but it might not be there on that day because you're traveling or something else coming up. So it takes some self-discipline to say, okay, I take some steps back today and think ahead and know, okay, this decision that I take is not going to like bleed into the upcoming days or even weeks, or worst case months. Like that's the absolute worst case, but it can happen. So you really have to know yourself in that case. And it's okay if it happens, if you learn from it. And this is how you mature as a lifter. So, and I believe that as a coach, for example, if your athletes have sessions coming up where external stressors are higher than usual, and it's something that is not coming up very frequently, so it's exceptional that it's coming up. So I believe that as a coach, you don't need to adapt the program. But for example, in Mel's case, what could be very interesting is if you as a coach know, okay, your lifter repeatedly has this day during the week that is going to be affected by other unusual external stressors, then to maybe adapt the program. And I think it could be interesting also then to, if you have, for example, sessions that have a higher priority because they have competition squat, competition bench, or competition deadlift, and it's going to be a heavy session, that you say, okay, maybe not put this session on this day or the day afterwards if you know that it's still going to affect the next day, and maybe use this as an opportunity to have a secondary day, which could also help the athlete to manage their expectations in a way where they are more agreeable to say, okay, I take a step back. I still do what I can. I go with the flow, but I don't feel like pushing this day anyways. So I think that could be interesting. But then again, it also always depends on who you're dealing with as an athlete.
I generally think that in a immature athlete, there's generally speaking two different categories for an immature athlete. There is the athlete who needs to learn how to embrace the suck and embrace some of the hard stuff and just do it anyway. The sets of 12 on Bulgarian split squats. Very few of us like that. And yet it benefits most all of us. So like learning the boundary of, oh, well, I don't want to do this because it's not fun. Well, that's probably a point where you need to just suck it up and do it anyway. And then where I think most of us tend to land is on the other side of the spectrum in learning when we need to back off and learning when we need to not do more. And I think what the signs and signals are of that are going to be different for each person. I've grown to the point where I've learned to recognize that the signs and signals from my body when they're telling me, hey, dude, slow down, stop doing so much work, things of that nature, I feel it very much more in like there's a joint restriction. And I feel like the joint doesn't want to move through the space that it wants to or that I believe that it needs to move through. But if it's just in the muscle, oh, let's go. I'm ready. I'm gonna work through this. Not a problem. Like DOMs, I can be hardly walk down the stairs from the first time I did oxidative protocol and I couldn't walk down the stairs. I can get through that. I can warm up and get that warm enough that I can move through it without any hindrance. But if it's something else, it seems a lot more in the joint. I've grown to the point where that's something I need to take a little bit more of a step back from and consider, is this the right work? Is this the right amount of work? What do I need to do to facilitate a ease of functional movement where I have access to squat depth, I have access to my like strong position of start position in deadlift or at chest position on bench press, things of that nature. And it just takes time to learn that those feelings and those sensations that are your warning signs, that are true warning signs and not just something that you need to work through to grow past the discomfort, are very different, I think, for each person. And those tend to be where I've grown to and listened to.
I like that analogy and thought process a lot. Something I have mentioned to athletes that's quite like Mike's sink analogy is that there's a bank of resources. And if you go into a session with only $20 in your bank and you try and withdraw your typical cost of $30 in that session, you will have to pay up that negative $10. And in the grand scope of your training block, is this the training session that matters? Or is it the cumulative effect of the whole block? And if you're going into training session with a surplus, that's where you want to be. But if you have to accommodate your cycle going into a session with a deficit or a debt, and you haven't paid that off, and if your training block is designed so that it takes a very standard amount each session, that debt will come up sometime, and it's probably not going to be in the session that you choose. So you can go to the session and you can choose to withdraw less. But if you don't make that decision now, it'll come up. And if it's not a training session you choose, guaranteed it's going to be the training session that matters the most to you, because that's usually how it works out.
That's a great way to put it.
And you have at this moment to pick the path you want to be on.
I really like that analogy. My brain functions really well with analogies, and I really like that one. It's similar to one of the ones that I've told people too, and only it extends on it further, is just the idea that there is no one session out there. There's no one training week out there that is going to change your ability so much that it changes the landscape of how competitive you are. There's not going to be a training week that takes you from, you know, at the top 20th percentile of your weight class and puts you in the top 5 percentile. Doesn't happen. It'll never happen, not for anybody. But there is that one session or that one week that could knock you way down the ladder if you overdraw, if you overdraft. You don't have there is no overdraft protection in this. So it's going to knock you down. Unless maybe, is there some overdraft protection in that analogy that you talk about?
None that I've come across that would be acceptable to use in the IPF rulebook. I usually use that one a lot when athletes get sick. And every time an athlete gets sick, they're usually like, so I'll miss this section. So I'll just put it on a double session a few days later and that'll be
Right.
great.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that's sometimes very tricky, especially because this reminds me of now one of my athletes who also recently moved here to the city. And I noticed that this is also very accumulative, because if you miss one session, it's definitely not the end of the world. However, if you repeatedly miss sessions, especially if you're an athlete that really thrives on consistency or thrives on a specific amount of exposures during the week in order for one particular lift to feel great, then it's going to be a problem if you start, especially if it's consistently a specific session during the week that you miss, because then you might miss out on this important exposure. And then all of a sudden, for example, I remember it was a sumo deadlifts. We figured out that this lifter really thrives on deadlifting 2 times per week. And then for like a few weeks, it became 1 deadlift exposure per week. And all of a sudden, like, deadlifts just started to be massively affected. Whereas with bench, for example, I saw that it wasn't the case, because he still got quite a good amount of exposures in. So that wasn't as much affected. But really, if you're moving or if you're just being affected by other external stressors, training might not be a priority at this moment, and that's okay. But if you have a bigger goal of you really want to improve your lift, you need to like make the sacrifice and say, okay, I know I'm fatigued, I'm tired at the moment. Going to training is the last thing I want to do, but I'm still going to do it anyways. I'm going to find the time. I'm going to try to get the main work in. What I, for example, also used to do whenever I really didn't have that much time was I prioritized certain lifts during the workout. And then, for example, the accessories, they are important, but in order for the entire week to not all of a sudden collapse, it's important to get like some exposures in, or bench or squats or deadlifts. So try to prioritize those if you're being affected by those kind of situations. And in general, yeah, it's really important to, if you're someone that thrives on this consistency, to try to be as consistent as possible. It's not always easy. People don't always have time, but you gotta make time for something if you have a goal and you want to become better. So, and that's a hard pill to swallow, but it's necessary sometimes.
Something that had originally helped me with that when I started going to the gym at 5 a.m., which entailed waking up very early, is I found that momentum is easy to build, especially if you have micro goals. So when I set the alarm for 4:15, the only thing in my mind was step 1, get physically out of bed. Don't hit the snooze, remove yourself from bed. Step 2, go to the washroom. Step 3, grab your gym stuff. Step 4, leave the home. Because if you're lying in bed, you hear the alarm clock go off and you start thinking about all the things you have to do, it becomes very insurmountable at that moment. So something that helped me get my priorities and habits in place was really thinking them as micro goals. And each successive micro goal that I hit carried momentum. And even at the gym, when you enter the gym, just grab the barbell and just do warm-up sets. And then once you've done your warm-up sets, okay, let's just add a plate. And then it becomes much easier to accomplish the end task.
Right. I feel like during those times, it's really important to adjust your expectations, but tell yourself, I'm going to execute. That's fine. I'll do what I can. Sometimes just going to the gym is what matters, and it can help your next sessions. If you're a powerlifter and you repeatedly miss certain sessions and all of a sudden your lifts are going to feel like trash, that's really demotivating. And as a coach, then it's your job as a coach to try to motivate the athlete and like be transparent about what's going on, because sometimes we tend to get very emotional as athletes and we're like, okay, fuck it. It's like this all or nothing mindset that you're like, okay, it feels trash. So you know what? I might as well just go home again. No, it's okay that it's going to feel like shit for a certain amount of time. But what I used to tell my athlete in this case, right, he was moving and his lift started to feel very heavy. I was like, you know what? It's only going to get better. If you keep showing up, this might be the lowest point right now. And the next session is it's maybe still going to feel heavy, but it's going to get better. Just show up. Like, it was everything I always said. Like, whenever I received messages like, yeah, this felt really heavy, I just want to quit. I was like, I don't care what it feels like. I know it's going to feel heavy for a certain amount of time. Just show up. Just lift. And this is really what's helped him. So after a while, things started to move better. And then the motivation came back again, because of course you don't feel like going to the gym if you're already dealing with things around in your life that are going on. And okay, training is also going to feel pretty crappy. Then you don't want to train, but you just have to push through this time. And then afterwards, it's going to there are going to be better times that are coming.
I think we just inadvertently shown why discipline's more important than motivation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because motivation is something that is going to fluctuate. You're not always going to feel motivated about something that you repeatedly have to do multiple times every week.
Right.
And that's normal because everything fluctuates in life, especially if you do something very frequently. But it's like motivation is really not all that matters. So just show up, keep lifting. Sometimes really people used to tell me all the time, just lift, just eat. But the more I lift, like the longer I lift, the more I start to see sense in it. The more I see, okay, you really don't have to overanalyze everything. Sometimes you really just have to lift. Afterwards, you can reflect.
It's the idea for me is, do the best you can to not make your choices based on feelings, because most of the time your feelings are temporary and it may or may not be accurate for where your life is actually at in the moment or what you're actually wanting to do or accomplish, down the road. So being able to not necessarily be pushed and pulled all over the place from those is important. And the other thing to think about with that as well, like that's why I like to think about RPE is not necessarily based on your feelings and how you feel, because it needs to be grounded in some other areas that are not just your feelings. And while that can be a guidepost and it can be something to help navigate RPE, it's not the only thing. And that's where RPE is really nuanced. And there's lots of different lenses and layers to it in how to use and apply the tool. And in this lens of like stress and recovery, like I think that is one of the fundamental misuses of RPE is a lot of people get distracted from using it appropriately in these down sessions and letting it be down. And I think if you are consistently making poor choices in RPE and constantly overshooting, especially in these times and trialations of life where life stress is high, there's probably some other things that you need to do to help cultivate better decision making. And then that tool is going to support your training in a better manner because you're also able to make better choices and decisions along the way. What has that been like as you guys have traveled or moved, like using that tool in that auto regulation of a down session and letting that go and letting it be down? And how do you like handle that? Because nobody likes it. It's not our favorite session when we go in and our E1RM's down 10 kilos. Like nobody enjoys that. It's not fun. And that can still be important and productive work. How do you like move forward and navigate from that without allowing it to derail you?
I think changing my perception of RPE being a mark or a score of how strong you are as rather a grading of your preparedness of the day and how well your program is working, and making it this objective mark on the program and execution of the program, rather than feeling like it's marking me as an athlete, that if the RPE is down, I am a bad athlete. No, if an RPE is higher at a lower weight than what I would expect, then I can look at my recovery, I can look at the program, and if those things seem like they're top notch, then let's see if there's a trend line. Because the single session is just a data point. With a down day, I look for the second data point. Is this consecutive, or is this just an anomaly on an otherwise good trend? And that has helped me quite a lot with RPE.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like the longer I lift, the more I adopt this approach of it is what it is. So I just go with the flow, really. Like if I have down sessions or also during the moving, I try to stay honest with myself. Not necessarily if it's an exceptional down session that I immediately try to reflect on, okay, what went on, like what could have influenced this. But just go with the flow. I accept it, and I accept that it's not going to be like this forever. Like it's not that one down session, as Mel says, makes you a bad athlete, or that all of a sudden it's the program that doesn't work. Like it can happen. It has multiple reasons. Sometimes, of course, if you have a program where you suddenly accumulate a lot of fatigue, or if external stressors in your life lead up to accumulated fatigue that affects your training. I've had, like, I especially noticed it with bench, for example, that all of a sudden I I failed a lift where I like a weight that I could normally easily do or that I would do every week. And that's when I get aware of that it's something very exceptional. It's not that all of a sudden within a day or a few days that I lost all of my progress. That's not realistic. I get that sometimes especially if we are emotional athletes, that we tend to think, okay, I made no progress. I am a bad athlete. I detrained. That it's normal to have those thoughts, but it's not realistic. And emotions aren't always realistic. You tend to think of you have certain thoughts in the heat of the moment, but then afterwards, if you take a step back, you start reflecting on it and you're like, okay, this happened, so maybe this could have affected this. So in those cases, I feel like it's very helpful to have a coach to also brainstorm with you, and sometimes to also hold a mirror in front of you and just give you, like, eat you to the answers that are right in front of you, but we can't always see it when we are emotional in the heat of the moment. So yeah, but when it comes to RPE in my own lifting, right, nowadays I'm just like, it is what it is. The longer you lift, the more you realize that it's not realistic to like make a 20 kilo progress within a block. So sometimes just lowering your expectations, but still keeping yourself up to a high standard, is what helped me the most. What about you, Ross?
Oh, that's fantastic from both of you. And I pro tip, right? Like, we're talking about stress and stress input and stress output, or rather recovery. Accepting it for what it is. One of the things that I've grown to appreciate, or one of the perspectives that I've grown to come to, is stress is a direct measurement, or if I could measure it anyway, stress is a direct measurement of my inability to accept what is. And if I'm capable of squatting 240 for my by one at 8 today, then it is what it is. That's what it is. And it adds more stress if I'm like, oh no, I want a 245. Now I'm mad about it. I just created more stress in my physical body by resisting what the truth of my training was for that day. All that's doing now is filling up the fatigue and filling up the stress, and now that's more that I have to recover from, just because I wanted 5 more kilos. And in the grand scheme of things, what does that 5 kilos really represent? Probably not much. So, like, I think all benefit from getting to that point of being able to accept where we're at in the training on that day and not take it so personally as a self-worth or value judgment if we're a little bit not as strong today as we were the other day. And if it is a trend, then it's something else that needs to be adjusted for. But if it's just a down session, or if it's a down week because you're moving, well, that just is what it is. That's just where you're at right now. And that doesn't mean that you will remain in that situation, in that place. And the only way to move forward from that space and from that place is also to accept it for what it is. But the more you resist it, the more unnecessary stress you are creating on yourself.
Right, it is what it is. That's the sum it up. I really like that. I think that's a good approach. You always have to be realistic and just go with the flow. That's everything you can do. And after all, like, it's just training. Not every training is a competition. You don't always have to be dialed in and perform at your best. So it's definitely okay. I think as an athlete, we just have to accept that we are human beings. Like, we are not machines. We don't always function at 100% capacity. And that's normal. If we refuse to believe it, then refuse to acknowledge it, then it can massively impact the other sessions that are upcoming. But if we go with the flow, we can, that's the smartest decisions we can take. But on the other hand, now we've talked about how external stressors can influence your training, but what about the actual training environment that you're training in? Ross, what can you tell us about what your environment that you're training in, how it can influence your session and also your motivation maybe in training?
There's definitely a lot of different ways that could be approached. And for me, where I've grown to that I think is the most productive way for me to view it is no matter what my training environment is, whether I'm at my home gym or I'm at the gym down the street or whatever it is, that environment and that change of environment is always an opportunity for me to focus on me and focus on the execution of the lift. And the change of the environment, if I allow that to distract me, then I'm also going to be easily distracted in a meet, because a squat is a squat is a squat. It is performed executionally the same way, regardless of the bar, regardless of the load, regardless of the room you're in, regardless of the temperature, regardless of the environment. The way you execute a squat remains the same no matter what. So I really like to look at change of environment as a challenge to my ability to focus. And I personally have grown to love that challenge and embrace that challenge. And a couple of the challenges for me that I tend to face on a regular basis, one, like in the summer in Georgia, it gets ungodly hot sometimes. And I have to focus on like embracing the hardship of that. being a northerner displaced to the south, that's a challenge for me. And when I allow myself to get pulled down and be distracted by the environment, that's when it actually causes me a lot more hardship than if I just focus on one more set, and focus on that execution. The other one that I really like is when Rosalie comes out and is playing in the gym. Am I able to tune her out and focus on my execution, or is it a distraction to me? And it's really cool to be in the middle of a heavy squat and her be, hey daddy. And I don't even know that she's saying that until I see the video. I'm like, oh, she was talking to me. That's cool. I was really focused. And like, she gets it. We've talked about it. The neighbor lady comes down and she'll be asking me questions. I tell her, I'm like, hey, Jean, when I'm lifting, I don't hear you. Just so you know, you can keep talking, but if you ask me a question, you're going to have to ask it again once the bar hits the rack, because I completely am in my own world and I don't acknowledge the existence of anything outside of my body. And where that's manifested to on the platform is that athletic flow state where I don't acknowledge the fact that I'm even in a powerlifting competition while I'm executing a lift. I don't even have visual memories of any lifts, hardly ever. For the most part, the only lifts that I have visual memory from are the ones that I miss. And I look at that as I've gotten pulled out of that flow state. And that's why I have visual memory. And the only other lift that I have visual memory from that I can recall over the past couple of years was the squat from this past Raw Nationals. And the way I look at it is that I only have visual memory of that because it got so slow. I had so much time to process more things. But outside of that, I don't have visual memory of lifts. I remember how things moved through space, but the visual sense, or the visual perception of it, nothing.
I liked her take on traveling in different locations and being resilient to the different environments. It reminds me of the concept of anti-fragility, in which you gain strength from disorder. And I go to a lot of different gyms due to travel, and where I can get a gym slot. And something that for me brought a lot of anchoring sense of pride was, I just need a barbell. I just need weights, and I hope the bench is at the right height. But if not, it's a weight, it's a barbell. I'll move it A to B, and whatever plays out, plays out. And a lot of the times I'll go into the gym not knowing all the equipment, but having that strong sense of self of, you just need weights and you just need a barbell to execute what you need to execute, I think has worked well for me, and not being so fragile that if your exact powerlifting barbell isn't there, does that unrattle you enough that it affects your session? If you don't get a very knurly bar for your deadlifts, are you so fragile that your mindset's gone because you can't get within a millimeter of your perfect grip? Because nothing is going to be perfect 100% of the time.
Definitely. I also like to see like those occasional sessions where you train in another gym or just train on different kind of equipments. as a challenge. Back in the days, it used to really throw me out because I was like, yeah, this is going to affect my lifts. But as a good athlete, you have to adapt. And also at a lot of competitions, you might not be able to warm up at competition equipment. So you're going to end up lifting on a platform on a different kind of material than you're warming up with. And it can throw you out, but you have to adapt to it. The most important part is that you can try to control what is within your control, and your emotions in that aspect are within your control. If you start practicing that, and you can practice that by going to different kind of gyms and just to adapt to it. So that's really important.
Sometimes you might find you get something out of the different equipment. I started lifting in a CrossFit gym and using Olympic barbells. So when you unrack an Olympic barbell with more than 300 pounds on it, you get a little whip. So when you do that, it can throw you off. So I had to unrack it with a very strong sense of stability, take my breath in, get really tight, my steps out, 1, 2, very, very centered, very little movement in the torso. And then that really helped me get that tightness and brace when I squat, because I'm used to getting that whip.
I think it also teaches you a lot of patience with yourself and to really try and connect with yourself. It's something that I've also noticed whenever I, for example, bench on different kind of equipment. It's going to feel different, but if I am patient with myself and I try to feel the equipment and listen to what my body tells me, then I can adapt to that kind of equipment much quicker than if I would be stubborn and tell myself, this is different, so it's going to suck. So really try to control what is within your control. Your mindset can influence your lift so much.
That's all so very true, and I agree with it. And again, the acceptance of what is. You can either accept that you get to deadlift with a crappy soft knurling bar, or you can stand there and be upset about it, and there's nothing you can do about it. Then at that point, all you're doing is adding stress on the organism. That's what it is. So accept it, move on, do the best you can, get what work in that you can, and that's going to be what it is. And I forget what like famous high level coach or athlete this came from, where I learned it from. But the idea of like every athlete has a plan going into getting into their game, into their session, whatever it is. But it's only a great athlete that has the ability to adapt their game plan to meet the evolving, changing considerations. And that's one of the things that I've always really enjoyed about the game of football is watching teams change what they're doing because the original game plan that they had come up with was not quite sticking or working, and they had to make some adaptations at halftime or at the end of the quarter or something along those lines to create some shift and change in the game. And that's one of the things that you see. Teams that are really successful are the ones that have the ability to execute and or change the game plan as needed based on the change of the environment, the change of the circumstances. And rather than fighting it, you accept it and move on. And as well, the other one that comes to my mind for that for people out there is the book from Lanny Basham, With Winning in Mind. He was an Olympic gold medal shooter. And one of the things that he talked about is the process and execution of shooting at the target remains the same no matter what your environment, no matter what the weather. And for him, he talks about if I focus on shooting, I shoot well. But if I let the weather change how I shoot, I'm going to mis-execute. I need to understand and accept and acknowledge the weather. If there's a 10-degree crosswind, I need to aim at a different spot, but the execution, the core process of the shooting remains the same, regardless of that environment. And as well, he talked about how if he wasn't accepting of that environment and he's like, oh man, it's snowing, it's raining, this is uncomfortable, he would shoot like crap because he's in that lens resisting the acceptance of the environment and the things that are outside of his control. There's nothing you can do to change that other than quit.
Something that reminded me of Ross was the ability of keeping focus on the outcome, not the situation. You focus on the outcome of a decent training session, focus on the outcome of nutrition. You start to align yourself in a way that gets you there rather than focusing on all the environmental noise that would otherwise distract you, and keep your focus on, if I need to get a good training session in, let's decide what that looks like and let's see if I can make it happen. And if I can't, we can let it go. It's the reoccurring theme through all these discussions we've had has been the council has advised that chilling out is the most important
Right.
part for a good execution, and that adding stress takes you away from being that outcome focused procedure that you know you can
Right.
execute.
Definitely. I feel like you can always try to do your best to have as much control in a situation as possible, to control your outcome. However, something I've also noticed now that before we've talked about motivation and how it fluctuates is that in your training environment, for example, like I used to train alone for the longest amount of time, and I'm a lifter who likes to train alone, so I have no problem with that. However, sometimes, like of course, when you're training alone and your motivation fluctuates, you might have a harder time to keep pushing and motivate yourself. And sometimes, if you are training in an environment, for example, a powerlifting gym, where your friends are training and you're someone that is very social or that needs this push, they can also influence your training. And this is something that is really cool because now that I moved here to Belgium, I actually got to notice the difference. And for me personally, it's insane because I always trained alone. Even in Luxembourg, when I trained in a gym, I still trained alone. And now, of course, like every powerlifter does their own program. But sometimes you squat together, sometimes you bench together, sometimes you deadlift together, or you're just in a room together and you watch each other's top sets and just cheer for each other. That is so cool. And it's something that now I'm looking forward to training way more often than I used to in the past. And I definitely believe also that it has had a positive outcome on my progress now recently. And that's really cool to notice.
I still like my solo sessions. When I first moved down here, I went from training alone to training at a gym with Vanessa's strength team, the group of powerlifters there. I like all the people. There wasn't anybody in the group that I would like had any like hard feelings towards. Everybody was cool. It was a cool environment, cool group of people. But I just like to lift at a certain pace, and I can't ever lift at that pace when I'm lifting with other people. And then I resist accepting that situation, and I'd rather just train alone. But I definitely know that there's a lot of people that thrive in that environment.
Yeah, definitely. Because when, for example, you're training in a gym and you have to share the equipment, your session can take way longer. Maybe your rest periods are much longer. But I believe it's something that in those case scenarios, you just have to adapt to it. At the end of the day, as an athlete, you have to adapt to a lot of situations. But if you can control it, like if you can choose between lifting in your home gym or lifting in a gym, and you have that option to choose, just choose the one that you feel the most comfortable with. Because at the end of the day, you're going to train multiple times per week. It takes up, like, I would say 95% of your powerlifting career. Like 95% of the time is going to be spent in training, and the remaining 5%, for example, at competitions. If you can choose where you're going to spend this amount of time, just try to pick the one that you feel the most comfortable with. Make it your safe space. That is really important. Like, you should be able to go to an environment where you feel safe, where you feel comfortable. Of course, it's not always the case because a lot of people are training in commercial gyms where it's not a powerlifting gym. There's a lot going on, many noise, many people. So you're going to be distracted. You might not. Some people even hesitate to film their top sets because of social anxiety. So it is very important to try to get into your own zone, and regardless where you're at, still, like, you're always going to bring yourself. So make yourself your safe space is also very important.
So I like that, because I was going to segue into the last question I had for y'all when we're talking about environment and these things that can impact us. What about the things that you can control about your environment? And what are some things that you do with your environment that you find that adds value to your training?
For the physical environment, I think since I actually train in a commercial gym, non-powerlifting gym, I started to change my perception of I quite enjoy it because you can people watch and you can see so many different people really going about their workouts in their own way. And I usually scan for, well, if I need a spot, who would I ask in this gym? Who's moving really well? And it's for me changing my perception of my environment and finding the things to be grateful for. Like, I am grateful that I worked in a place that allows me to go to the gym. Like, yep, Mel's going to the gym to do her workout. And they're very supportive. I have the ability to work out in different locations and not be affected. And finding gratitude in the environment that you're currently in, I think has helped a lot. One of probably the most extensive length I've gone to get to a gym to work out was I was in a remote island that had one gym an hour drive away. My colleague had a rental car. So I called someone about borrowing a moped to call someone about getting access to the gym. So I drove an hour and a half on a moped on a beautiful road to meet someone to get that access to work out in this gym. And I thought, how cool is it that I have the discipline to do all these steps to get my workout in? I had a really good session that day too. And then I drove back on this beautiful road in the forest with amazing feral coastal line on one way. So no matter what environment you're in, think about how you're probably going to it not injured. You have the ability to work out at all. And I'm sure we've all gone through times where we can't work out and we can't do the things that we like. And feeling excitement for other people in your surrounding doing what they think they need to do to get better. And I found that has helped with motivation and environmental and something I've taken in control of how I can see and perceive my environment.
I feel like you just spoke from my soul. Like, gratitude is something that now I've noticed I have every day when I go to training. Like, I noticed that I've become a way more flexible lifter in this short amount of time because before I used to train alone, I always used to have the equipment for myself. And now, whenever I train in the gym, I'm actually really happy when people are sharing the equipment with me because I get to connect with those people that share the same passion, and it's really exciting. So whenever I'm there, I just look around and I'm always like, damn, it's so cool to be here with all of those people. But at the same time, like, for example, I can turn on my own music if I have a heavy session coming up, or if someone else is playing their own music and it maybe distracts me a bit because, for example, to a hard style, I can't really relate to that. It just confuses me. So then, for example, I just put on my own headphones during the sets. But I always notice that between the sets, often I just take them off again to socialize. But when it matters, I get to concentrate on the lift and on the bar only and not what's around me. So it's really cool to be able to practice that and to just become more flexible and to like flip the switch and stay like, of course I still stay focused when I talk with people, but to actually get to have fun and then also focus on the work when I get under the bar. That's pretty nice.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I mean, gratitude is one of the best ways to boost that recovery mechanism, especially if we're talking about having some of those stressors from the outside coming in that aren't part of the training stress. Like, gratitude's such a great way to recover from that stuff. And like being a home gym trainer, one of the things that I do is I've put a couple of different like decorations up on the wall that remind me of stuff like that. That I got several years back. I was going through a downtime, and it sucked, and I was really getting frustrated. And I remember watching a video that Ellis McLean put on his YouTube about why he loved powerlifting and how much fun it was. And I made a couple of custom posters that just had in fun, weird letters, "Have fun." And so that's one of my reminders. Like, you know what, man, I'm out here. Let's have fun with this. No matter what the exercise is, what the protocol is, whether it's difficult or it's easy, let's just have fun. Like, you have always loved to lift weights. Let's just come out here and have fun, regardless of the outcome of the session, if it's PRs or not PRs. I'm just going to come out and have fun. And I think that's along the same lines of the gratitude aspect. And so I think for those that are out there with the home gym, like, you have the ability to like put those things up in your environment that can help provide that boost of positivity and create that environment that, normally you have that support from a team and your friends of lifting. Well, you don't have that if you're a solo home gym goer. You likely can do that though with a little bit of wall decor that's intentional.
No, absolutely, that's true. I was gonna say, for example, during the lockdown, I guess for a lot of people it was hard also to suddenly adapt, and like those who had the privilege to have a home gym, because a lot of equipment was actually out of stock during that time. I remember, so it was hard for a lot of people to like adjust to that, and to get to motivate themselves to start training in their own home. So, and it was also something that affected me. But what I also did with the wall decoration, I just painted a Powerpuff Girl on the wall and wrote my name on it, and that was really cool. And then it just always motivated me whenever I looked in the mirror and I saw that, it was like, damn, this is cool. So it just actually started to feel like more or less a gym, I would say.
Yeah.
Also because I had this separate room, like some people lifted in their kitchen. So it was harder to create this atmosphere. But being able to create an atmosphere is very cool. It's very valuable.
Fantastic.
I've seen that in your videos so many times, and I love that powerful girl. Every time I see, I'm like, heck yeah, what a cool place to live. I guess what has helped me with travel and working out and the environment and ecosystem of instability was relieving judgment from that exact moment, controlling the controllables within my power, and then looping back, enjoying the session. And I think that releases yourself from a lot of stress that you can
Definitely.
artificially create.
I agree. I thank you so much for joining me, and everybody out there listening, we appreciate you joining us. There are some bonus recovery points for you out there to be had if you share this episode on your social media and tag Reactive Training Systems. We have been told scientifically that it will boost your recovery. So go get that recovery and share it on your social media. We'll see y'all in the next one.